API, Building REST CRUD API with Node.js. So what's REST API? REST stands for Representational State Transfer. So that means REST is a architectural design which allows you to define an approach for communicating between different parties. Like if you want to communicate between a server to server or a client to a server or client to server to a client, REST allows you to create a standardized approach where you can define how the communication between the different parties will happen. REST is also regarded as the language of internet. So most of the newer frameworks like React, Angular, Vue.js rely on REST APIs to get the data transferred, even for Android and iOS applications. So anywhere where you're developing an application which connects to a server or a client connects to a server, that will be probably using a REST API. So we can say it's a language of internet where most of the things on internet actually rely on REST APIs provided by third party or the APIs which they are themselves creating. So one good thing about REST is a stateless model where the client only stores the information who is actually accessing the information and the server does not have any information about it. So that means servers do not create any sessions for a particular user. They just send information back to the client side whenever anyone requests for it. So that means it's much more easy to load balance. It's much more easy to maintain REST APIs other than the traditional way of handling the features of REST. REST is simpler than SOAP because it relies on a much more simpler way of defining how the data transfer will work, how the URL schemas will work. REST supports XML and JSON. So if you already have some APIs which are designed on XML or providing data based on XML, they can be migrated to a RESTful architecture. Or if you're designing new APIs and you want something to be created in JSON or a mix of JSON plus XML, that can also be done. So REST is completely independent of how you want to design your data transfer. You can choose XML or JSON for it. RESTful APIs are very easy to document. Solutions like Postman, Swagger helps you in creating documentation for a very simple application or even for an enterprise level application. They help you in creating different types of documentations for your needs. So it's much more easy to work with RESTful APIs so that you can easily document them. You can share the documentation across your different teams and they can easily collaborate with you. Handling errors in RESTful APIs is also very easy because RESTful APIs works on HTTP methods. And if you have any kind of error or if you have any kind of a problem with your server going on, you can just send error code from your server based on the HTTP methods or HTTP codes which you have. Like if you have an internal server error, you can just send a HTTP code of 500 and client side will know that there is an internal server error which actually happened on the system. It's very easy to handle out REST errors with REST APIs. Principles of REST API. REST APIs are stateless. They are used for communicating between client side and server side. They have a uniform interface. They can be cached at either on the client side or the server side. They follow a layered system and you can code them on demand. Okay, so we'll cover the first part, which is stateless. So like I said, REST APIs are stateless. So when you are creating a RESTful API, the practice is we should not store any session information onto the server. Anytime when you are communicating between a client side and server side, you only send tokens for authentication, like a JWT token for authenticating that this is a particular user, is he valid or not. When you're making a request from the client to the server only validates that token. It doesn't care about who's the user, because if the token is valid and if some information is requested by the user, the server will respond back to it. There are different ways of implementing JWT tokens in it, and which allows you to do full complete authentication in your RESTful services. The benefit of this is if you have a load balanced system, you don't need to care about which server has to respond back to what client. Because if the session is not binded to a particular server on a load balanced machine or environment, then any server which is running your application can respond back to the client side. So it's much more easier to load balance RESTful APIs. Next point is client and server communication. So REST APIs help you in communicating from your client side to your server side or server side to your client side. Most of the new applications which are getting created, like Android-based applications, iOS, or web applications based on React, Angular, Vue.js, they all use REST APIs. Most of the data which you are going to use is coming through REST APIs. And there are third-party solutions like third-party APIs which are provided by companies, like for weather APIs or for doing currency conversion or doing market price analysis or these kind of things. So those all provide you REST APIs. So REST APIs are kind of the future for communication between client side and server side. Third point, uniform interface. So when we're making a RESTful API, we generally follow a standard way of defining how the URLs are going to work, how the schema is going to be defined for a particular use case. So most of the REST APIs will look similar. So if you have resources, URLs will be based on resources for you. So REST APIs are designed to handle different resources. Resources are like data in your application. Like example, if you're making some data of a group of people, you can just say /people is my resource. So that kind of a URL schema will be used in different applications, and most of the applications which actually depend on this kind of a data set or resource will follow the same kind of a URL schema. It's very easy for developers to know what this resource is actually working on because they might have worked on the same kind of a URL schema in different applications. So it's very convenient for developers to work with REST APIs. Next point is cacheable. So REST APIs are also cacheable. So like that's a very good benefit of them because REST APIs don't work on session information and they don't rely on any cookies to be doing any authentication. So you can actually cache data which are coming from REST APIs. And REST APIs actually have very simple data structures like JSON and XML. XML can be a little heavy, but JSON is very lightweight. So if you are doing any kind of a computation and getting some results based on some database queries or some machine learning logic, you can actually cache that logic on your server or even on your client side so that you don't need to make that same request for the same resource again and again. You can just get the information once and reuse the information again and again in your application. The fifth point is layered system. So when we are working with REST APIs are designed on a layered approach. Like if you have multiple databases or multiple places from where your data is going to be received, what you can do is you can design an architecture where one resource is coming from one different location and one resource is coming from a different database. Or even if you already have a legacy system like a SOAP API, and now you want to migrate your SOAP API into a RESTful API, that can also be done. So you can create a wrapper of a REST API on your legacy code, which can actually help you in migrating from a SOAP-based architecture to a REST-based architecture. So RESTful APIs can be used as a layer architecture on any kind of a legacy system, or they can be used on any kind of a new system also. The last point is code on demand. That means when we are making a RESTful API, it doesn't require to create everything on the first day of development. You can create as your requirements increase. So if you are working with a particular part on the UI or on the client side, and that requires only a particular set of resources, you can first code those resources, start your application, deliver your application to the customers. Then once newer things are coming in, you can just create those resources on the go, do a kind of agile development for your APIs. So it's very easy. It helps us as a developer a lot to create APIs based on demands. Otherwise, as a developer, you cannot create everything in one go and deploy it to the customer. So that's going to take a lot of time and energy. So instead of that, you can just create few APIs, deliver to the customer. You see if the APIs are working fine, how the interactions are with the customer, and then scale your APIs based on it. So one of the most important thing in REST APIs is methods of REST API. So when we're working with REST APIs, we actually rely on HTTP methods which are get, post, put, and delete. So these are HTTP methods which are been from the days when HTTP protocol was defined. So when you are requesting any data from, or when you're actually posting data, or you want to delete some records from your database, you actually rely on these methods. So what happens is in a RESTful architecture, we define that a particular resource is available on a particular URL. So in a simple example, we have a group of people and we'll say /people will represent that group of people in our database. So now if I want to get the data of those people, I will just say /people and make a get request to the server. So when you're making a HTTP request to the server, we'll define that this HTTP request is based on the get method. And I want to get the information on a particular URL, which is /people. And everything from that URL will be returned back. So internally, the server will have a logic to go to the database and get the information. The end user customer can see the information. So in this case, it can be React or Angular or Android or iOS application, which gets the data, prints the list of all the people. Now you want to add new people. So for that, we are not going to create a different URL. What we're going to use is we are going to use the same resource, but instead of using the get method from HTTP, we're going to use the post method. So when we send a request again on the same URL, which is the same resource, which is /people with the method post, we can send a payload that defines what we want to store in the database. And based on our logic on our server, the system will receive the information and process the information and store it based on how we configure the code for it. So instead of creating different URLs for different type of data which we want to request or push back to the server, we just use the HTTP methods for it. So similar to that, we use put for updating the data. So if you already have some resources and you want to update them, you can just write that make a HTTP request to the /people URL and define the method as put. So the system will identify that it's a put request. It requires to update some data. We have to write some data into the database back. So we'll define how that procedure will work, and the system will receive that call and handle that for you. Okay. Same for delete. So in this case, delete will just delete the record. So if you say /people, it would delete everything. If we say /people / some particular name like Praveen, so it will delete the data for the Praveen in the system. So when you're working with REST APIs, this methods part is going to be used a lot. So it creates some kind of a confusion like how the data is getting transferred from which one resource to how. So always remember get is for getting the data. Post is for pushing back the data to the server side so that the server can store the information. Put is if you already have some information and you want to update it. So you use the put method on that resource and write all the update query in your server side. And delete is for deleting the data for that particular resource. So now we want to see how this API is going to be created using Node.js. So we will develop a RESTful API in Node.js. So for that, first we need to open our editor. So now I'm going to create a Express application in this code. Okay. So Express is a web framework which can be used along with Node.js. So it's based on Node.js actually. Express has a dependency on Node.js. It will not work without it. But this web framework allows you to create RESTful APIs. It gives you a structure of how to create RESTful APIs and also gives you helper methods, middlewares, and plugins to how configure your Node.js application and create APIs through it. So the first thing is I'm going to create a new file. Okay, so I have this project. This is the project which we created in our last session and add our Express code on top of it. So for that, first thing what we have to do is we have to install Express. For that, in my command prompt or in my terminal, I will write npm install -- save for saving that in our package.json Express. So this installs our node module, which is Express. We have a dependency on it so that it allows us to configure our application. So once done, we'll create a new file called application.js. You can name it as application server index.js. It's up to you what you prefer. In this file, I'm going to import Express. So we're going to write const express equal to require Express. So once Express is imported into our code, we need to create an Express application. So that's very simple. So we'll write const app equal to Express and we'll execute this function. So this creates our Express application on the app variable. Now this app variable, I'm going to define our API URLs. So like I said, in RESTful APIs, everything is based on resources. So every resource has a URL. So a very simple example, if you have people in your database, a people table will point to a resource URL which will be /people. A person in that people database, like a row, will look like something like, if you just say people /row. So if you want to point to a person in the people database, the URL will look like people /person. The person will be the name of the person which you want to look for. Okay. And something else like if you want to find out what's the person's job or age, that kind of information will point like in our database that will be inside our person, inside our row for a particular person, inside the age. So we'll define the resource URL like people /person. The person will be the name of the person, and what we want the age of the person. So we'll have the URL like this. So we'll just create a RESTful API to match this URL schema. So the first thing is we're going to write app.get. So get is the method which is used for getting the data. Like I said, when you need to get data for a particular resource, we use the HTTP get method. So in this case, app.get means we want a handler to handle all the API requests for a particular URL on the get method. So we defined the method as get. Now we want to define the URL for it. So we'll write /people. Okay. So if any request comes for /people, which has HTTP method as get, this handler will be called. Okay. So now we have to define the handler. So we'll write function. So this will be the callback for this URL. And over here, we have to write request and response. So there are two arguments which we receive. First is request, second is response. Request has information about what the information has been sent from the client side to the server side, and response or REST means what information you want to send as a response from your server to the client side. So over here I will just write res dot send, and now I can just write any information which I want to send. So in this case I will just write a string hello world. Okay, and save this file and run this code. So now the URL is configured, but we haven't started the server. So when we are writing a Node.js application, we don't need to rely on Apache or IIS or Nginx for running a server, because Node.js provides its own development server or a server which we can use along with it, because it can actually listen to all the network requests on your system. So Node.js will help you create your own server. Okay, so we'll just create a server over here. Okay, so now we'll start our server. So for starting our server, we just write app.listen and you define which port number we want to listen to. So by default, it starts on the local host, which is your local machine, and you have to define a particular port number. So in my case, I'll just write 3000, which is used for most of the Node.js applications. So I'll just write 3000 over here, and that's it. Now I want to run this application. So this Node.js application has to be executed by using Node.js. So I will go back to my terminal and write node application.js. Once done, you will see that it's not going to print anything after that command, because it just started the application and it doesn't give any consoles or return messages that the application is started. But right now it's started. So what we can do is we can just go to our browser and see this application. Go to localhost 3000. And you can see it prints cannot get / because that's the default URL which goes on that URL. But right now we actually want to point to people over here. So once I run localhost colon 3000 / people, it prints hello world. That's the message which I sent from my Node.js application over here. So now we created an API over here, a simple API which returns hello world when we point to the people URL. So now we can write any kind of a database logic, like if you want to have a MongoDB connection or a SQL connection over here, you can write everything over here. So you can use any kind of a database or any other SOAP API to get the data, or even other RESTful APIs to get the data and send it through this API. So I would say you can use MongoDB over here to connect your database. So in this example, I'm not going to connect with MongoDB, but I'm going to show you how a simple JSON data will be sent. So you can just write rest.json and define any JSON data over here. So this will be a JavaScript object. In this JavaScript object, whatever you want to send, you can define. So I will just write people is equal to an array, and in that array, every person's name will be added over here. Like you will have different objects for every person. So I will just write Praveen, and at the end, I'll just write response.end like this. Okay. So now what I have to do is I have to restart the Node.js application, because when you started the application, it will not listen to the file changes. So it will not restart the application once you save any new file. What you have to do is you have to stop your application and run the application again. Go back to the same URL, refresh, and you will see it prints out a JSON data. This means that now we have a JSON API based on REST architecture and returns information about people. So this is very simple. Like we implemented a get API. Now we want to make it a little more complex. Now we want to see how a post API or a delete API will work. So that's very simple to write. The business logic will be a little different, but for defining how the API is created, so that's very simple. So we just write, I'll just copy the same code again, and instead of get, I will write post, and the URL will remain the same because that's our resource URL. So we will not change that URL. Okay. So now instead of keeping this JSON data over here in the callback, I will keep it over here in the out of the callback function in the file. So I'll write people is equal to JSON people, and I will send people along with the API request in the response. Okay. So because now people is equal to object, you can pass people into rest.json so that it converts the object into a valid JSON and sends it back along the API. Now we're going to try how the post request works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this people object and add some people to it. So the people will have person and the person has to have a name. Okay. In this part, I will just going to send some information from our client side to the server and add the data. So one tricky thing is we cannot make post calls from our client side or our browser directly. The reason is because when you type in any URL in the address bar, that automatically configures it's for a GET request. And for making a post call from the client side, you actually need to submit a form or make a XML HTTP request or a AJAX request from the client side. So instead of doing that, I'm going to use Postman to test my API and develop it. So I'll just open Postman. So Postman is a Chrome plugin which can be used for sending requests to your server. So in this case, I'm just going to clean up everything. Okay, I'm in Postman now. I want to make a request to the server. So the Postman will be a client and server is at localhost 3000/people. That's the first resource which is handling. So I want to make a GET request. So I will pick GET from the drop down and click on send. Okay. So it sends the request and prints this information back. So that's a valid JSON, and now we can see that the request returned people, and the people is an array which has persons in it. It can be n number of people over here. Now I want to make a post request to this URL. In the drop down, I will just pick post and send it from here. So now I got an error which says cannot post people because the API is not configured for that right now. The reason is I have added the code for it, but I haven't restarted the Node.js server. So I have to restart the Node.js server by running node application. So I will just go to the terminal and say node application.js and restart the server again. So now it will listen for the post request also. So we'll do the same request again. You can see it returns people again. So there's no change in any data right now, like it's the same data set which is coming back. So let's make some changes to it. I want to send some data in my API request, which is going to be information about the person which I want to add into the database. So I'll write name. So this is something which you do in Postman, and there are different ways of doing it in Postman also. This is one of the simplest way. So I'll just write Amit over here. Okay. So I'm just configuring that I want to send a body. In that body, there will be a record which is of type JSON, which has a key name and a value which is Amit. So I want to send this to the server. So this request go to the server, and in the server now I have to handle this request. So for getting that information, I will go to the request part of my API. So over here I will just write console.log request and see what request actually prints. So I'll restart the server and send the request again. Once done, you'll see there is a lot of data in your terminal over here, like a lot of information coming for the API. Okay. We have to look for a key which is body in this data. Okay, a little hard to find. Okay, let's do one thing. Instead of request, I will write request dot body and start the server again just to simplify things and make the API request again. Alright, so it shows as undefined, so it's not able to send the body. Alright, so no problem, we'll just send it as a form. So we'll write name and Amit over here, send the request. Okay, so I think the reason is we haven't configured the middlewares for it. So we'll just write body parser as a middleware. So body parser is a middleware which allows us to parse the body which is sent from the request and attaches with the request object. So let's configure it in our code. So it's very simple. So now I've installed the body parser middleware. It's provided by Express only. So I'll just import body parser, require, and in our app, we have to say app has to use body parser. We'll define over here. That's it. So let's see how this changes our code. Run the application again. Go to the same URL and okay, I think they have changed the documentation. Okay, so I think we haven't configured the body parser correctly. There might be some changes. So I think what we have to do is have some different codes compared. So what you have to do is from the body parser, now they have added different type of packages. We have like body parser, URL encoded, or which we have to use individually. I'll write those over here. Okay, so these are the packages which we want to use from the body parser or method. We'll just write app.use body parser URL encoded and app.use body parser JSON. So this allows you to handle JSON or form sent from the client side. Once done, I will restart the application again. Right, there's a typo in the body parser name. So just rename it again, run the server again a typo. Okay, the server started again. Now we'll send a request through Postman and see what that returns. So send a request from Postman, and in our system, we received a blank object. That means we are able to parse the body, but it doesn't have any information over here right now. The reason is, let's see. So you have to send it as xww form URL encoded. So we'll write name and a value. So we'll just write Amit, send. And you can see I've received a value which is name Amit over here. So that's our data which is being sent from our client side to our server. Okay. So now I can just receive this information. So I can just write request.body.name and get this information. So if I run the server again, or like restart the server again, send the same request again. In the console.log, you can see only the Amit value is getting printed. So now simply what I will do is I will write a simple if condition which says if we have request.body and if that request.body has a value of name, a key of name, then in our people data, the variable which we have another array which is called people. We want to push a new record to it which will have name equal to request dot body dot name. Okay, very simple. So we just added a validation check, like if the request has a body and body has a name, then only go to the people variable. In that people variable there is an object which is array which is named as people again. On that array we'll just push a new value. Okay, so what we are pushing is we are pushing a new object which has a key called name, and the name is equal to request.body.name. Okay, that's the value. Once done, it will move to the next line and respond back with the data of people. So let's run the server again, and I'm sending name as Amit. So let's send this request, and you can see now the data has changed. Instead of sending Parveen in the data set, it sends Amit also. So I can just write John, and it adds John over here. So whatever the data you want to send from this key just adds into the variable over here on the server side. So this data is coming from the server side. If you make this API call multiple times, it will return you the latest data set after adding the result which you sent. If you don't send anything, like I'm sending a blank request, I'm not sending the form, I just unchecked this name over here, I send the request. So it returns the same data set which is actually running on the system. So it's not storing anything into a database. It just has the information inside the memory. So it's just a JavaScript variable on the Node.js server, which is in memory only. And once the server gets stopped and restarts again, this in-memory data will also get removed. Once I start the server again, you can see, and make the same call, will receive Parveen only, because Parveen was the data which is actually hard coded into the code. Otherwise, if you store any new data, that will be only in memory and will be removed once the server is restarted. So this just shows you how you can get information from the client side and store inside a database. Like instead of writing something in the memory, you can write a logic to get a MongoDB connection or a MySQL connection or SQL connection, any kind of a database which you want to use. So there are lots of databases like Firebase. AWS has their own standard ones like MongoDB and MySQL. Any of them can be used to store the data. So it's up to you how you want to design the application's data. Right now, I'm just using in-memory data over here only. Now, the next thing is making a put call or a delete call. So those are very simple also. Again, like I'm just going to copy the code. I'll just copy the code of post, and instead of writing post, I'll write put. The resource URL will be again people, and you define whatever you want to do if this request comes in. So if you want to remove or update the data, you can write a check to find out if the particular name is actually in the database and update that, or just give an error that this person is not available and we cannot change the data. So it's up to you how you want to define the logic for that. Same way you can define the delete call. So just write app.delete and define the delete call, in which you can delete the information for the particular user. Okay. The next part is pointing to a specific resource in your dataset. So right now this dataset is for people, and I want to get data for a person, like I want to get the data for Praveen. So how can I do that? In that case, what you can do is you can define that a new URL like app.get, in which the resource URL will be people/person. So the person is, right now I'm hard coding person over here, but that means you want to send information for a particular person from here. Okay, so you can just send name is equal to person from here. Save this code, run the server again. So I will just go to Postman and run this code. So I'll just say people/person, run this code, and you'll get, okay, I got an error because I'm sending a post call, but post call is not configured, so I have to change from the drop down that I want to use get call over here. So now you can see it's sending information about name and the person. Right now it's hard coded, like it's not doing any computation on the backend. But what you can do is this person over here, the name, this is something which is going to be different for every request. Like you might request for Amit, you might request for Praveen, you might request for XYZ. So this part is going to be a parameter for our API. Okay. So to define a parameter, we would write colon and name. This defines that this part of the URL is actually a parameter which can be used in our JavaScript code to do a different query or do a different kind of business logic. So in this case, I'm just write request dot params dot name. Okay. So I'm just returning a JavaScript object, a name, request dot params dot name. Now I will restart the server and go back to the Postman and run the same code again. So it prints person again, same data which we already sent. But now the new thing is you can just write Amit, send the request again, and it prints Amit now, because it picks up the parameter which I'm sending in the URL. So this way you can write your URLs based on different parameters. You don't have to create millions of different URLs for different millions of users you have. You can just define that this part of the URL is a parameter, and that will be received in your code, and you can do your business logic based on it. So you can just write Praveen over here, prints Praveen. So these parameters are not limited to one. You can send n number of parameters in the URL, and it's up to you how you want to define those parameters. They can be named as anything. Like in this case, I'm just naming them as name. You can name this as person, you can name this as user, whatever you like. So depending on your business needs or how your team is comfortable with the names, you can pick up any parameter name and use in your code. So it's up to you. And if you have multiple parameters, you can just write slash age slash something. The only thing is when you're defining multiple parameters, you have to follow the same kind of URL to match it. If you only write name slash age and you only call for name, this URL will not be called. So I will just show you a demo. The URL right now says people slash name slash age, and I'm just making a call to people slash Praveen. So you can see it's not giving any data because it says this URL is not handled over here right now, Postman. The reason is it requires a parameter called age. So if I write 11 over here, it prints out that data because now the actual URL is getting matched. So you always have to keep in mind that what you are creating in the URL, and will you be providing all the information, or you are just going to provide some set of the information in your code. In this case, if you want to handle two different scenarios, like if I want to send a request to people slash name and people slash age, you can just write people slash name as the first one, like define it first. And if this doesn't matches, then moves to the next line and finds out the second option which is available for matching. All this URL schema is matched from top to bottom. So anything on the top which matches the URL will get the handler. If the schema is not matching, it passes the control to the next definition which you have right now. And then if that doesn't matches, it moves to the next line. And if nothing matches, then it just gives you a 404 that it's not able to handle this request. So this way you can define parameters also in your API requests. All right, so let's get back to the presentation. Okay, guys, so this covers our session for creating a REST API with Node.js. Thank you guys for joining in.